Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here with us today. We are going to be breaking down a really fascinating recent broadcast that tackles two highly distinct yet incredibly pressing issues currently dominating Australian political commentary. First, we're looking at the harsh realities faced by public figures right now, and then we're going to do a hard pivot to a major economic decision that's affecting everyday families. Let's get right into the source material.
So, where exactly do we draw the line in political discourse? It's a heavy question, right? But today's source material forces us to look squarely at the really harsh realities of being a public figure in Australia today. The panel discussion we're analyzing paints a picture of a political climate that is becoming increasingly volatile, and it's absolutely testing the boundaries of what is acceptable in our public square.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, threats in Australian politics. Number 2, security and historical precedent. 3, respect versus freedom of speech. 4, extending fuel excise relief. And finally, number 5, the need for certainty.
Starting us off with Part 1, threats in Australian politics, and specifically, the vulnerability of public figures.
The broadcast opens with a deeply concerning look at the rising safety threats directed at political figures, focusing specifically on Senator Pauline Hanson. The commentators point to a recent incident at the National Press Club where a banner was dropped right behind her, essentially illustrating how physically exposed she actually is. But the panel notes that horrific death threats haven't just been directed at her alone. They've now literally extended to her daughter and her young grandsons, who are aged just 8 and 11. It is a sobering look at how collateral damage in politics can impact entirely innocent family members.
Because of this severe escalation, the panel actively discusses whether the current threat level means certain politicians should now require continuous armed protection. They debate whether a figure like Hanson, given the highly specific and targeted nature of the threats against her entire family, has reached a point of vulnerability where 24/7 armored guards are just a tragic necessity in modern Australian politics.
Now, what's really interesting here is the personal context brought into the discussion. One of the commentators uses his own past experience to argue that Australia's approach to protecting politicians is historically way too relaxed. He notes that he had to get 24-hour police protection just a week into his tenure as Minister for Prisons. It highlights that while we might think of Australia as super easygoing, our systems for protecting public servants can sometimes be described as, in his exact words, very lax.
So, where is this coming from? Delving into the root causes of these tensions, one commentator claims that these threats stem from deep political divides. Specifically, they argue that political opponents, who the panelist describes as the left, are scared of how effectively Hanson articulates community anger, and that this fear is manifesting as intense hostility. This really just highlights how deeply polarized the commentary around these public figures has become.
Interestingly enough, the panel expresses genuine surprise that Hanson chose to speak out publicly about these death threats. Standard police advice in these situations is actually to keep it quiet. Authorities generally advise against publicizing threats, mostly because going public can inadvertently give the perpetrators the credit or the attention they're desperately seeking.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, security and historical precedent, looking at Australia's track record.
To build some context here, the commentators map out the extreme rarity of political violence in Australia to anchor their discussion. They point to the assassination of John Newman back in the 1990s as essentially the sole major historical precedent for an extreme political killing in the country. The panel contrasts that really rare event with today's climate, warning that we are currently seeing rising tensions and a dangerous normalization of severe abuse.
And the panel really goes out of its way to emphasize that this is absolutely not an isolated or partisan issue. While Pauline Hanson is the catalyst for the conversation, the commentators explicitly note that politicians across the entire political spectrum, including Liberal member Angus Taylor and Labour Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, are all receiving completely unacceptable levels of abuse. The threat to safety crosses all party lines.
And here is the broader societal consequence the commentators warn about. If we normalize offensive remarks and continuous harassment, we risk driving good, capable people away from political life altogether. One panelist bluntly warns that we risk ending up with the dregs in Parliament if this continues. This is particularly poignant as the panel notes that Hanson's own daughter, who is currently receiving threats herself, is actually eyeing a potential political run in Tasmania down the track.
Which brings us to Section 3, respect versus freedom of speech, and how we navigate public discourse. This perfectly illustrates a vital tension the commentators are grappling with. On one hand, we have the vital Australian ideal of open conversation, the right to freedom of speech to make your views known in the public discourse, even if they are highly controversial.
But on the other hand, we see the completely unacceptable reality of harassment and death threats. The panel's concluding thought on this topic is basically a plea to recognize that while robust debate is the Australian way, taking extreme steps to threaten a person's life or family fundamentally is not.
$400 million. That is the massive budget cost of a major economic decision recently discussed in the broadcast, extending the fuel excise relief. And with that, we are making a hard pivot here to the second half of our explainer.
Welcome to Section 4, Extending Fuel Excise Relief, focusing on the cost of living.
So, the source material introduces a completely separate economic debate regarding the cost of fuel at the pump. The broadcast features Prime Minister Anthony Albanese explaining his rationale for a partial extension of the fuel excise relief. The Prime Minister argues that global pressures, including conflicts overseas, will have a long economic tail. Therefore, he states that scaling the relief back gradually, what he calls a step down, is sensible rather than just pulling the relief completely in one fell swoop.
The panel then weighs in on the Prime Minister's decision, essentially arguing that this extension is the least he could do. The commentators point out some deeper systemic issues, like how successive governments have allowed the loss of local Australian fuel refineries, which makes the country way more vulnerable to global shocks. They also claim that the government actually made a nice little earner, basically a profit, from the extra excise tax collected during panic buying linked to global conflicts, specifically mentioning a war in Iran.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the need for certainty and planning for the future.
The final major criticism raised by the panel is really all about communication and structure. The government has been using what the panel describes as a short-term, month-by-month approach, announcing these 30-day extensions. The commentators argue vigorously against this, demanding instead that the government provide long-term certainty by simply announcing an extension that lasts all the way until Christmas.
So, the crucial point is really this. Everyday families are caught in the middle of these 30-day cycles. You simply cannot effectively plan a long weekend away, organize big family get-togethers, or accurately manage the family budget if you're constantly waiting for a monthly announcement to see if fuel prices are going to suddenly spike. The commentators stress that everyday Australians need this financial certainty to live their lives without surprise loadings hitting their wallets.
We have definitely covered a lot of ground today, from the terrifying reality of political death threats to the incredibly practical debate over the price of fuel. And it leaves us with this final thought to ponder. What do Australians truly expect from their political leaders today? How do we balance demanding physical safety and respect for our representatives while simultaneously demanding decisive, long-term economic support for everyday families? It's a complex landscape for sure, and I hope this breakdown helped make it just a bit clearer. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.